Good morning. This is a very interesting experiment here. So we'll be very interested in getting your feedback both here and those of you who are joining virtually. Just going to bring up my slide. So I'm Carol Lee, Professor Emeritus off in the journey of fake retirement with Judith, and chair of the of this workshop. All right, so let's get how to do this. All right, is that it? Okay. So in terms of a history of this project, that at the November 2016 meeting, the members of the National Academy of Education, this was right after the election, I had raised questions about the Academy's role in thinking about the kinds of challenges around so much divisiveness then going forward, and what role did education play in terms of preparing our young people to engage in the complexities of the civic issues with which we wrestle. And that recommendation was then taken up by the RAC Research Advisory Committee of the National Academy of Education, and we were able to secure funding from the Hewlett Foundation in 2019 to begin this work. I have this sort of arbitrary set of slides about the complexity of the challenges in civic life that we're facing. Certainly in the midst of the challenges that we're going through right now, these are almost unnecessary, but I have them, so I'll share them anyway. That there was the Southern Poverty Law Center conducted a survey of over, I think it was 10,000 educators back in November of 2016. And one of the things that they had observed was the ways in which so much bullying was really going on in schools that were really based on sort of ideological orientations that young people had. And that schools were having challenges in terms of trying to figure out how to wrestle with these difficulties that young people were having. 8 and 10 report heightened anxiety on the part of marginalized students, including immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, LGBT students, use of derogatory language directed at students of color. 2/3 report that administrators have been responsive. 4 out of 10 don't think their schools have action plans, so the kids themselves are feeling very vulnerable in these circumstances. In the midst of this, one of the things that we kind of have wrestled with in this project is, on the one hand, much of the challenge around civic engagement has been positioned as primarily the work that takes place in civics classes that kids may take when they have to take a U.S. Constitution test at the end of 8th grade, and a civics class, you know, as perhaps juniors or seniors or at high school. Maybe this occurs in history classes and social studies classes, and maybe it doesn't. But we felt in this panels that we pulled together, that the sources of knowledge and dispositions that our young people needed to develop were very complex, and that schools, we've drawn and influenced by the work of Amy Gutman in the book Democratic Education, where she argues that public education is perhaps the only site in a democracy where we can explicitly focus on the development of democratic ideals and dispositions to engage in civic reasoning, that this posed a very special challenge and opportunity. One of the issues that we think is important in the complexity, is part of what we're going to wrestle with across these presentations, is really trying to disentangle the complexity of this, what we're calling this problem space, is that there's something very special about the way in which the founding fathers, as they are called, sort of conceptualized how we would work through difference and decision-making in this democracy. One certainly had to do with considering the whole question of relationships of distributions of power and decision-making between the federal government, state government, and then the question of the rights of individuals. This engaging that the decision-making processes at all these different levels would be very much influenced by the decisions that citizens made in terms of elections. So this whole question around who gets to vote has been a long historical conundrum in the society. We have a Bill of Rights that can be expanded over time. And so many of the rights of women to vote, rights of African Americans have been influenced by changes to the Bill of Rights, but the structure is such that that's hard to do. The whole issue of structures around the limits of power among levels of the government in relationship to individual rights. And so many of the challenges that we wrestle with here have to do with what is the purview of the Supreme Court versus the Congress versus state governments versus individuals. But that flexibility at some level opens up both possibilities as well as constraints. The whole question of the system of checks and balances. I've heard some recent discussion now of people saying that maybe the Supreme Court justices should not have life appointments, but rather should be elected. The Supreme Court, in a very unique position in terms of these sort of competing political interests, in the sense that they, justices do have appointments for life and are able to, in some sense, overturn decisions that state governments or federal governments may make. And Thomas Jefferson, I think, raised the very important challenge early on. He said that an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. Jefferson also said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, implying that sustaining a democracy required a citizenry who always critically examined itself and the actions of its government. And the question with which we wrestle in part in this workshop is, what role does education, broadly speaking, play in preparing young people to actually engage in the challenge that Jefferson offered? One of the challenges in the complexity of this sort of conceptualization of who we are as a society, what does our democracy mean, the sort of self-narrative that we have of ourselves as a sort of shining city on the hill, is the fact that this marvelous experiment that I tried to define some of the parameters of in this last slide was born out of two Holocausts. One, the genocide against the indigenous nations, that which is still being wrestled with along many dimensions. There are many people who really don't even understand that there are, in fact, independent nations within the United States that are indigenous nations, and a whole history of complexity around that. And of course, the enslavement of peoples of African descent. Our history of over 400 years of colonial conquest and legal apartheid. So a lot of times people don't think with, in the era when so many people were working against apartheid in South Africa, that the United States had a system of legal apartheid longer than South Africa, and this complex system of shared governance. So this is sort of part of the background that sort of bleeds into all of these complex issues that we're wrestling with, and it is not part of the story that we tell ourselves, and the question of what role potentially does public education in helping young people to understand that. We have, as you all know, with the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, an assessment that's given knowledge in terms of civics, and not in the most recent one, only 23% of students scored at or above level, but this is not anything new. This has been a historic pattern that our kids have really very low levels of knowledge about the government and political system. One example, and part of what I'm going to try to do in the slides that I'm sharing with you today, is just to try to provide examples of the complexity of what it means for us to engage and to think about bringing young people into engaging in these very complex civic issues. So this was a few years ago. It was a televised debate between Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Ted Cruz over the Affordable Care Act. And there were two people in the audience who had raised questions to the two of them about the Affordable Care Act. One was a small business owner who asked, how can I grow my business with the lean profit margin in my industry if I'm required to pay for the health insurance of my employees? Currently, she hired less than 50 employees, but she hoped to be able to expand to more than 50 employees, where the ACA would now require that she pay for the health insurance of her employees. So that was sort of one position on one side of the equation, if you will. And then there was an older woman who said she had an ongoing major health challenge, indicated she would be forced to pay tens of thousands of dollars for her medication if it were not for the ACA and life-saving drugs that she could not pay for on her own. So again, this becomes a sort of an example when you've got a complex question here around the maintenance of the Affordable Care Act, which is, you know, front and center in terms of the battles in the election right now on both sides of the equation, both the Democratic and the Republican side, if you will, and two citizens who are raising really complex issues, both of which have real significance in terms of their concerns. But this question in terms of our role as citizens in influencing our legislators is how do we weigh these sort of competing interests? This kind of reasoning, we argue, requires that we prepare young people to be able to weigh evidence, to consider multiple perspectives, to develop what we think of as a democratic disposition to empathize with others, to think in a democratic society, in our instance, in which ultimately progress is made through compromise, meaning that both sides of the equation ultimately have to be in a position to consider what in the position of others is potentially viable to consider. And understanding that ultimately what underlies our decision-making processes are the warrants that we draw upon. That is, what are the underlying sort of moral beliefs and values, if you will, that would give someone who has a different belief from ours to consider at least this alternate position. Examples of civic dilemmas: the American Academy of Arts and Science is hosting forums on the challenges of scientists communicating with the public, or over ecological debates, for example, on impacts of the Keystone pipeline and fracking. There are moral issues around the Dakota Access Pipeline's impact on the sacred land of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and its ecological impact in light of potential economic opportunities opened up by the pipeline. So again, these are real-world challenges. They're ones in which citizens have opportunities to weigh in, and they're competing interests that are difficult to disentangle. One of the things that we were very much interested in this work, and one of the panels that will be presented tomorrow, is actually a panel that Nyla Nazir and I co-chaired, was trying to say that if we're going to prepare young people to engage in this kind of complex reasoning around difficult issues, it needs to be informed not just by propositions that we have, but what does the science of, or sciences, I should say, of learning and development tell us about the kinds of conditions that need to be in play in order to foster a conceptual change and shifts in belief systems. And so we thought in terms of the role of work in human development around what's entailed in influencing the perceptions that we have as human beings, because perceptions essentially drive how we interpret experiences that we have in life. Work in cognitive psychology around what's entailed in learning in systems, because any shifts that we're able to facilitate around youth development, around civic reasoning and debate, particularly in the context of schools, is going to involve engaging schooling as a system. Issues around conceptual change are at the heart of the work that we're doing, that kids come in with sets of beliefs, some of which are not based in factual reality, or some of which are tied to long-standing sort of beliefs and relationships in family life that potentially get contested. This has happened, for example, around issues and complexities of teaching about evolution in schools, where there are families who fundamentally don't believe in evolution. And so issues of conceptual change come into play. And epistemology, that is the disposition to engage with complexity as opposed to thinking that knowledge acquisition is about simple right or wrong facts. Work that we can learn from social psychology around implicit bias, which I think is particularly a relevant set of issues today, considering the fact that there was a point in our history where the articulation of bias, whether it was based on presumptions about race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, quote unquote disability or otherwise, could be explicitly stated as being okay. But we're in an age now where that's not okay, but it doesn't mean that those beliefs are not still there. And so what can the field of social psychology help us understand about how implicit bias operates, how it can be challenged in ways that are safe, if you will, work from cultural psychology in terms of understanding issues having to do with diversity across the human species, and certainly work in neurosciences. So in some of our panel reports, we're drawing from across those fields to suggest as a national academy that there is in fact a scientific research base that can inform how we think about wrestling with this challenge. And particularly moving around in terms of youth development and even our work as adults in thinking about engaging in civic reasoning and debate, to not be fooled by thinking that this simply is a cognitive question about knowledge. And that is the decision making that we engage in as human beings is deeply influenced by not only our knowledge, if you will, but by our perceptions of our experiences, our perceptions of what we consider to be real, that's very much filtered by our emotions and our feelings. So one very poignant, I think, example of the complexity of the problem space came after the shooting at Parkland High School in Florida, where young people began to do exactly what we're calling for, and that is to become actively engaged in thinking about their leadership roles in influencing conditions that were impacting their lives. And of course, they had that wonderful, huge rally, a march in DC. But there were these competing conceptions of what's the problem around gun violence. Some people who consider that these involve procedural remedies, that if we can simply create laws that restrict people's access to weapons, that somehow that in itself is going to solve the problem. Other people articulating this is a problem of public health, that people who are engaging in these violent acts have mental problems and have not been able to get the kind of health supports that they need. Some others see it, and you actually saw it at the rally, interestingly enough, in the different presentations that the young people presented. Some people seeing it as problems of state-sanctioned violence. So in Chicago, where I'm from, there have been these consistent stories coming out of the Chicago police having warrants to go into homes, but the warrants were wrong. And you get these images coming on the news of the police are breaking through, windows and the like to come into the house. There are children in the house, and the children have guns pointed at their heads, and their hands confined, et cetera. So that's another sort of lens, if you will, on this problem of gun violence. And that, interestingly enough, that there were, even though much of what we saw on the news was about young people who had a particular vision of how to address this problem, there were also young people who had very different visions about how to handle the problem. And this complexity here, I think, again, links up to Diana Hess's work, which is going to be presented at one of the panels, about what it means in these public spaces to take up this work when kids and parents, teachers in the community, for example, may have very different points of view. Let me assure you that my cough is post-nasal drip that preceded this virus. So, Also that in looking at this problem around the gun violence, we're arguing that preparing young people to engage with the complexity of this problem involves on drawing knowledge from a variety of disciplines from which they can gain knowledge in the context of schooling. There's also been lots of discussion, certainly from the 2016 election, and it's coming up again now, around Russian interference in our election process, some of which involve the promotion on the media of a variety of ads. And the problem, at least that I have argued, is less that these things appear and more so about what are the knowledge and dispositions of people, particularly young people, in looking at these things and figuring out what actually is trying to be communicated in here. What are the sources of unreliability, if you will, that if we had a population who had the critical knowledge, irrespective of what their political orientation might be, to recognize the unreliability in here, then we would not be subject to the influence of such ads. We have, as the steering committee for this project, myself as the chair, James Banks from the University of Washington, Sarah Friedman, University of California, Berkeley, Diana Hess, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Joe Conning from University of California, Riverside, Peter Levin from Tufts, Nyla Nazir, president of the Spencer Foundation, and I might add the new incoming president of AERA, Walter Parker from the University of Washington, and Judith Tony Porter from the University of Maryland. So we recruited here not only a sort of a stellar committee, but people who represent an array of the kinds of disciplines that we think are going to be important in doing this work. In terms of our timelines and next steps, we are anticipating completing these papers by the summer of 2020. What we particularly appreciate from those of you who have agreed to come in and give us feedback is that we want to make sure that we're not simply talking to one another, but that we've gotten realistic feedback from a diversity of stakeholders in terms of the kinds of the nature of the arguments and claims that we're making, and particularly recommendations for what it could mean to take this work up in the broader world. The papers, once they're finished, will be posted as a holistic report on the National Academy website. And we argue for it as a holistic report because we don't want, even though each paper deals with a different topic, we don't want the audience to think that these separate topics are sort of sufficient, but rather we want people to look at the holistic argument that we are attempting to make. We're going after that to try to create some specialized reports for different stakeholders. And your feedback on how to think about this process would be very helpful. So what is it that policymakers need in contrast perhaps to what practitioners might need, researchers, and also making sure that we have products that we can reach out to community organizations around the importance of this work and what might be recommendations for what the various stakeholders might do. And then finally, to think about what this means in terms of systemic reports. We don't want this to be a report that gets up on the website and dies, off on its own, but what it means to really try to take this work out in the real world, trying to bring together, for example, research organizations. We've tried in this work to draw from a variety of academic disciplines, but they tend to be academic disciplines that don't talk to one another. And so trying to bring these organizations, AERA, SRCD, et cetera, together in terms of conversations about the holistic nature of supports that we're going to need to do this work with young people, trying to meet with actual stakeholders and NGOs, many of whom are trying to already do this work on the ground already, public presentations that we will make. And there is some similar, not exactly related, but there's some work by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences where they've basically been going around the country trying to gather data on what young people are doing in terms of being engaged in the work of civic reasoning and debate. I think that's me, right? So we're going to proceed now with the panel papers. There will be a presentation of about 30 minutes, I believe it is, for each panel. We have invited a respondent, someone who's not been working on the project, but who works in that field, to give us feedback. And then we want to open it up for critical feedback from you. So there's no feelings to be hurt here. This is important work. We want to make sure that we can get as much honest feedback as possible, both about the conceptual work, the nature of the arguments and evidence, are the things to consider that we haven't done, and particularly recommendations for recommendations about how to move forward. So we're going to start with the first panel, Philosophical Foundations of Moral Reasoning, and I'm not sure who's doing the